Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Pete's CD and LP World. Today, we're going to talk about my favorite top 10 live albums. And this is not the greatest live albums of all time. These are my favorite top 10 of albums I own. So you'll notice that I don't have some of the great live albums of all times, the Allman Brothers live at the Fillmore, albums like that. I've always loved live albums since I was a kid. I guess that comes from seeing live performances on TV when I was younger and the early days of MTV, where a lot of the clips they showed early on in the first couple years were actually live concert clips. So back then, live albums were a way for a band to break big. It had a lot of their, usually had their greatest hits, and it was a way to get into a band also. You Before YouTube or the internet, you couldn't really hear a band's music unless you bought one of their albums or had heard some of their songs on the radio. But a live album was always a good way to get an overall overview of a band's catalog. And during the 80s, the live album sort of faded away and became not that important any longer. And as the late 80s came on, home video became the big norm for a band to release a live home video, and eventually into the 90s, they started releasing DVDs. So the live album by the 90s became sort of an obsolete item, but a lot of bands still do put out live albums, but it's not the same as the ones that came out previously in the 70s. And I know a lot of bands do put out DVDs and CDs at the same time of the same show, which is okay, I guess. But even that now, I don't think bands are putting out as many DVDs or Blu-rays as they had been. You see a lot of concerts now on Access TV, that sort of thing. So again, these are my favorite live albums. They're not the greatest live albums of all time. Like I said, I don't have a lot of the live albums that are considered classic. I don't have Frampton Comes Alive, the Allman Brothers live at the Fillmore, James Brown live at the Apollo. But then again, let's get started. So my first one is Bruce Springsteen live 1975 to 85. And this was originally a 5-record set, and it is a 3 CD set. It originally came out in, I believe, the Christmas of 85. And from what I remember, this was the first album that really made CDs take off. It was a big Christmas item that year. And I have to say the majority of this, I believe, is from the Born in the USA tour. There's not too many tracks from the 70s and early 80s. But it does have a big cross-section of songs from all of his albums. And it really does sound good. And you get a feeling of what he was really like live. The only thing about this is it's not really like a concert, which makes this album sort of a milestone in the fact that it was one of the first anthology live albums. Meaning, previously live albums were usually either produced or put together sort of depicting an artist's concert, even though a lot of them weren't exactly like their concerts had been, or a particular concert from a particular tour. This one was basically coming out and saying this is a live retrospective. And that became sort of, now more than ever, it's commonplace. The bands are putting out anthology live albums of their career. But this is definitely a great one. Next one is a live album from Pete Townsend called Deep End Live. And the reason why I like this album is the production on it is really good. It really just sounds great, especially on vinyl. And it's only a single album. It has few songs on it. Behind Blue Eyes, Eyesight to the Blind, Pinball Wizard, and a couple of his solo tunes. Pete Townsend, now that you look back, didn't really tour in the 80s, surprisingly. After the farewell tour in 82 with The Who, he didn't tour again on a regular basis until The Who in 1989. But I believe this was a couple of concerts he did at the Brixton Academy for charity. and he put out this live album. So I definitely recommend getting this, especially on vinyl. The next album is the first live album I ever bought, and it's actually the first Alice Cooper album I've ever bought. It's called The Alice Cooper Show. This is from his Lace and Whiskey tour. So this is not the original Alice Cooper band, but this band does have Steve Hunter and Dick Wagner, which the songs on here, especially the older versions, really are killer. And I think this band played a lot better live than the original band. It's kind of odd that the Alice Cooper band didn't put out a live album in their height of popularity. I think they've put out a live album from the $1 Billion Babies tour recent years, but this was his only live album of the 70s, and it definitely got me hooked on Alice, and it's still one of my favorites from him, especially the version of $1 Billion Babies on here. It just kills. Next one up is from one of my favorite bands, but there's also a couple versions of it. So that would be Cheap Trick at Budokan. So this is the original one that came out in '78, I believe, and it was a single album. And actually, the version of I Want You to Want Me that was a hit is from this. And this is one of those live albums where the songs on here sound better than the recorded studio tracks from their first and second album. In Color sounds kind of flat compared to the songs on here. And most of the songs are from In Color. It has Surrender from Heaven Tonight, which hasn't come out yet, and Lookout, which was an unreleased song, and Need Your Love, which ended up on Dream Police. So at the time, you actually got some exclusive songs on here as well. This was originally put out for the Japanese market, eventually was released in the United States. Then, in the 80s, they released Budokan 2, which is the other half of the concert, so it's all the songs that weren't on here. And this is great as well. Then, in the 2000s, they released Budokan the Complete Concert. Now, I actually prefer the sound on this because the guitars sound way better on this than this. This was mixed to sound just like the original, so it flows like a standard concert, which is understandable. So I believe this is out of print now. So if you ever see this album and you're a Cheap Trick fan, pick it up because the guitars sound way better on this than Budokan the Complete Concert. Got that? I know it's confusion. Next one is Deep Purple Made in Japan. Now this is considered one of the best live albums of all time. And it's the classic lineup, the Mark II lineup. And some of these songs originally on vinyl, I believe, took up a whole side of an album. Space Truckin' and the Mule. This one has an extra CD with the encores. Black Knight, Speed King, and Lucille, which to me are some of the best songs on the album. So this actually crept into my top 10 after that. So I can't imagine seeing this band back in the 70s and only seeing between 7 and 10 songs live. You know, most bands back then did have one song that they extended and jammed out, but Deep Purple, they had several songs that were 15, 20 minutes. And I prefer this version with the extra songs in it, and they're just on fire on this album. Deep Purple is one of those bands I believe have released, probably 30 live albums from all their eras, and all their major concerts are documented live. But this was the original, and probably still the best. Next one, Judas Priest, Unleashed in the East. This album was the album that brought them basically into the heavy metal world. Before that, they were metal, hadn't had much success in the US. I believe they were somewhat popular in Japan. And the great thing about this live album is most of the songs are actually from Sad Wings of Destiny, with one or two songs from each of the other albums. Nothing from their first album. But the versions on here are way better, much like Kiss Alive and Cheap Trick at Budokan. The versions on here are the definitive versions. Now this is the remaster that came out, and it has 4 extra songs: Rock Forever, Delivering the Goods, Hellbent for Leather, and Starbreaker. I don't understand how they left off Hellbent for Leather originally on this. Because that was probably their best song up until that point, and it was the tour for that album. But nevertheless, even if you see this on LP, the original album is great also. Great sound. There's been a lot said about how much work they did in the studio to correct it. Supposedly, Rob Halford had vocal problems during this Japan tour because he was sick. But even if they fixed that, so what? It's still one of the great live albums. And it's also the beginning of really the black leather and studs. Before this, Judas Priest almost dressed like hippies, wearing kimonos and not really uniform. But this image here is really the start of heavy metal as we know it. Next up, we're down to the top 4. And this is from also one of my favorite bands, The Kinks. It's called Live One for the Road. Sorry about that. This came out in 1979 after their big resurgence into arena rock. And this covers their whole career. And this is really the sort of heavy arena rock version of the Kinks. It's not the version that took over most of the 70s, which had a horn section, female background singers, etc. They do have a keyboard player at this time in the band. But they play everything from You Really Got Me to a lot of their early 70s songs, 20th Century Man, Lola, and a lot of songs from the newest album at the time, Low Budget. The best songs on here, I believe, are the last 2, Victoria and David Watts, which are from their late 60s period. The only thing I complain about this album a lot is they are maybe too many songs from Low Budget. I would have replaced either like National Health, Attitude, and what's the other one on here? Pressure. I would have replaced those with something else because there's nothing from Sleepwalker on here, and there's only one song from Misfits. So I would probably put something else from those albums on here. I don't know if they ever played any of their older songs that aren't on here. Can't imagine they didn't play like Waterloo Sunset or something like that. They also played Prince of the Punks on here, which was the B-side of Father Christmas. So you get a live version here because that wasn't available on an album until they released the CD remasters. I believe it's on Sleepwalker. But this definitely captures how energetic they were, and it sounds great. So if you ever see this, pick it up. Oh, the CD remaster of this has one extra song called Slum Kids, which is a song they played on their Preservation tour, where they did both Preservation albums. And it wasn't a song that appeared on any of those albums, so it's kind of odd that they played that live. But anyway, they put it on the remaster of this CD for some reason. So that's what's different about that CD. Next one, number 3, is definitely considered one of the great live albums of all time again. This is The Who Live at Leeds. And this just sounds amazing. Believe it or not, even on CD. This is the 90s remaster. This came out in 1995. This has the rest of the concert except the Tommy performance, which I don't mind because I've seen Tommy and heard Tommy live so many times. This is everything else in the concert. So one of the great songs on here is the opening track, Heaven and Hell, which is sung by John Entwistle. I believe that was just like a B-side single. Kind of odd that at this time they were opening with that song. I don't know what people must have thought when they see The Who and they're opening with a song that they probably don't know, and then John Entwistle singing it. The thing is, the song kills. The rest of this album is just blistering. This is The Who at its most bombastic, loud, heavy. If I ever see it on vinyl, I'll probably pick it up. The original album only had 5 songs, I believe. Can't Explain, Young Man Blues, Substitute, Summertime Blues, and My Generation, I believe. Could be wrong about that, but if you ever see this, you have to own this. Even if you're not a Who fan, you have to own this. Next one up, is from my favorite band, or one of my favorite bands. It's Kiss Alive. And it was tough to me to choose between this and Alive 2. I like them both for different reasons. This one is just one of the greatest live albums of all time. And this is one, again, that the songs on here are the definitive versions. I like the studio versions of their first three albums, but on here they really are live and kick it. Even though a lot has been said about the authenticity of the live tracks on here. Eddie Kramer said, who produced this, a lot of the tracks were redone. All the drum tracks are live. Some of the guitar, some of the vocals were redone, but that's what you would expect. The reason I like Alive 2 is because that album is more of an authentic live album, I believe. Because if you listen to bootlegs from this period and you listen to bootlegs from Alive 2, they really did sound like what they sound like on Alive 2 live. This period, they were a lot more sloppy. They don't sound as raw and aggressive like they do on this. But nevertheless, this is still one of the great live albums of all time. Even if you don't like Kiss, I would suggest owning this. And down to my favorite live album, which when I started doing this, I took out all my live albums, or the ones that I thought would make the top 10. And it's surprised to find out that this one is my favorite, Live After Death from Iron Maiden. Now, this is an album that came out in the 80s. It came out in 85. Definitely the best live album of the 80s, in my opinion. And it was one of the few live albums of the 80s that had any significance, really. And this is from their World Slavery Tour, which was for the Power Slave album. And up until that time, it has all their big songs, including songs from their first two albums with Paul Di'Anno. And the great thing about this album, too, is side 4 is taken from the Hammersmith Odeon in London. The first three sides are from the Long Beach Arena. Side 4 has songs that they didn't play, I think, on the U.S. tour. Wrathchild, 22 Acacia Avenue, Children of the Damned, Die With Your Boots On, and Phantom of the Opera. So they were cool enough to include all those songs from the UK that they didn't play live. Also, this album is great because it comes with basically almost like a tour booklet. It has all the information you could ever want about this tour. It has all the equipment they used, all the tour dates, pictures, and I remember seeing, this is the album that really got me into Iron Maiden because they had a home video of this as well, and MTV showed it one Halloween night. It was either probably later than 85, because I believe I remember going to the store and getting this for my birthday in 85 or 86. But they showed that video and it was awesome, which if you can get the home video of this, it's awesome as well to see the stage and everything. But again, it doesn't have those songs from the UK. So this is a definite must. So some of my runners-up are albums that I love but didn't quite feel made the top 10 for me. For more reasons than one. The first one is Priest Live. So this is Judas Priest's second live album. It came out in 86 after the Turbo Tour, or maybe this came out in 87. So this covers from British Steel through Turbo, and it has a lot of songs from those albums. Doesn't have anything from the albums previous to that. They put out a home video at the time that does have Green Manalishi and Hellbent for Leather on it. Now, this is the remaster, and it has a couple extra tracks. Screaming for Vengeance, Rock Hard Ride Free, and Hellbent for Leather. I don't think any of these extra bonus tracks are from this tour, especially Rock Hard Ride Free. I don't think they played that on this tour. But nevertheless, this album sounds really good, and it's along with Unleashed in the East, you'll have basically every greatest hit Priest live song. Pick that up as well if you see it. Next one, I have two from this artist, Frank Zappa. I wanted to include a live album from Frank Zappa. He's released so many live albums. I was actually going to include one of the You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore live albums, because I like those a lot. But there was a lot of albums he recorded original music live on, meaning like Shake Your Booty. This, I guess, is considered a studio album, but all the basic tracks, I believe, were recorded live. So a lot of his studio albums are actually live albums with the audience sound removed. But this is also one of my favorite live albums from him. It does contain a lot of new tracks on it, and a couple of older songs like Peaches and Regalia, Brown Shoes Don't Make It. But a lot of these songs are actually original songs also, but it's done in a live album setting, meaning that the audience is included. And this is one of his early 80s albums. It has Steve Vai on guitar, and it's always one that I enjoyed. I used to have this on vinyl. Not sure why I got rid of it, but now I got the CD. Next one is from Queen, Live Killers. This came out in 1979 originally. This is from the Jazz Tour. So it's sort of a bookend to the era that ends the 70s. And this has a lot of great songs on it. Not any hits that I don't think are missing from here. Actually, this album sounds like a radio broadcast. It definitely was not a produced live album, meaning they took apart the tracks and either re-recorded them or enhanced them. There's even some in-between song banter that is bleeped, so which also leads me to believe that it was made for radio at the time. And it's not the best sounding live album, but it's definitely raw, and you can tell it's no overdubs or anything here. So definitely pick this up if you're a Queen fan. Queen's another band who have released several live albums after that. I believe several 80s tours are documented, and that famous Marquee show early on is documented, but this is great as well. I used to have the LP of this also. Next two are two that everyone considers great live albums, some of the greatest of all time. I didn't get them later in life, so they didn't have that impact on me like other albums did. But UFO Strangers of the Night, if you can own this UFO album alone, I think, and be happy. This has all the hits from Michael Schenker. The playing on here is unbelievable. His solos are just off the charts on here. Great sounding live album. Definitely a big influence on a lot of players. But like I said, I got this album later in life, so it didn't have the impact on me. I had a UFO compilation, basically all the studio versions of these songs too. So other than that, I haven't gotten into UFO much. I'm not into them as much as some other people, but hey, can't like everything like everybody else. The other one is Thin Lizzy, Live and Dangerous. Again, I probably got this album about 20 years ago, in the late 90s. And it's definitely a great live album. But again, I didn't discover Thin Lizzy. I knew some of their big hits, but I didn't discover them till about 20 years ago. And I had bought this because everybody said what a great live album it is. And it is. It's just not one that I grew up on, so it didn't end up in my top 10, but I definitely recommend it. Next one is kind of an odd pick. It's a band that a lot of maybe rock fans don't know. It's All. They are a punk band out of California. So they came out in the 80s and basically are the descendants of the Descendants. So the Descendants were a punk band that started in the late 70s, had a few albums out. So I believe their singer left. They got a new singer and changed the name to All. There were other members here and there that changed, but that's the short of it. Since then, they've continued on and off as All and the Descendants. This was their live album they released, I believe, in '89, which has pretty much all the good All songs on it. Not all the good ones, but it's a great live album, very raw sounding. So if you pick this up, see it. Then they released this album in 2001. So it's called Live Plus One, but the plus one is actually Descendants Live. So they did a tour with, I believe, 2 different singers. So they would do a Descendants set and an All set. So this has 2 CDs, which is kind of cool because on the 2 sets, there's a couple songs that they do from each band. So the Descendants does a couple All songs and All does a couple Descendants songs, which is cool. It's not the greatest live album. This is definitely a better performance. And actually, I forgot, they have another one called Hallraker Live, which is pretty good as well. So if you're not a fan of punk, I'm not a huge fan of punk, but I love this band. I've loved them since the 80s. And if you're into drummers, Bill Stevenson is one of my favorite drummers. He definitely has that surf influence, but he just, in the way that Rush has Neil Peart, who just adds something to every song, he definitely does as well. So, next one is not a live album at all, but it's the best of Twisted Sister. But on this, 1, 2, 3, 4, they have 6 live songs from early in their career at the Marquee Club in the UK. Now, these live songs are some of the best live tracks I've ever heard in my life, so I had to mention this. The rest of this album is just their greatest hits. You Can't Stop Rock and Roll, We're Not Going to Take It, blah, blah, blah. But they added these 6 songs from the Marquee show. They do a version of It's On Only Rock and Roll. It's like a 10-minute version, and it's probably my favorite live song ever. Dee Snider, in the middle of the song, there's a breakdown, and he's yelling at audience members, telling them to start moving around. There's a great line in there where he says, "I don't care if you're wearing an Iron Maiden t-shirt," things like that. So even if you have all the Twisted Sister albums, pick this up because the live tracks are great. I believe some of them were released on 12-inch singles, but some of them are unreleased and exclusive to this, but pick this up if you see it. Next one is, I'm not sure if it counts as a live album either. This is Jimi Hendrix Radio 1. I believe all these tracks were recorded live in the BBC early on. I believe this was done, must be sometime around Access Bold to Love, because there's a couple songs from that. But there's also a lot of songs on here that he does covers. Driving South, Catfish Blues, Killing Floor, Day Tripper. And the live versions of the songs on here are great, and they're recorded live in the studio. I think they did a reissue of this later on. This came out in this came out in '88. I believe in the late '90s, early 2000s, they put out a double CD of this, and I've seen it before, and it's missing some of the songs are on here. So I would definitely pick this up. I know there's a lot of Hendrix live albums. Woodstock is great. I have that also. Fillmore East, another one that's considered one of the great ones of all time, but I don't have it, so I didn't include it, but this was my favorite Hendrix. Next one. Ozzy, Speak of the Devil. You might say, well, where's Tribute? I had this album first. I had it on cassette in the early 80s. And besides Iron Man and Paranoid, I hadn't heard a lot of Black Sabbath songs. So this was my first introduction to a lot of the classic Black Sabbath songs. It was actually one of my first Ozzy albums. Brad Gillis is on guitar here. Album sounds great. This is another one that rumored to have a lot of studio work done to it after this was recorded. He recorded this shortly after Randy Rhoads' death. From what I hear, they planned on doing this with Randy Rhoads. He did not want to do it. So I guess after Randy's death, he decided to do it with Brad Gillis. It's the only album that Brad Gillis appears on. There are no Ozzy songs on here. It's a double live album of all Black Sabbath songs. I'm assuming because they hadn't really done a proper live document with Sabbath. They did have one live album called Live at Last, which I have on vinyl. It's sort of controversial whether it's official release or not. But it sounds not that great, and it's sort of not a great selection of songs. But I actually like the versions of these Sabbath songs on here. I have to say, I know this is blasphemy, but I think Brad Gillis plays the Black Sabbath songs better than Randy Rhoads did. I think on Tribute there's only 2 or 3 anyway. But his tone is more of a Tony Iommi darker tone. So I definitely enjoy this album a lot. And this is one of those albums that they sort of, I think, put out of print. Ozzy's and Sharon, they like to sort of try to erase a lot of his history sometimes. So this one, I think, Ultimate Sin are out of print currently for whatever reason. But if you happen to see this, pick it up. And my last mention is going to be Another album that I didn't have until recently, which is Wings Over America from Paul McCartney and Wings. And this is a great live album. It's a triple live album taken from his big U.S. tour sometime in the mid-'70s. They do some Beatles songs on there, but back then he was focused on his solo and Wings career. So you get a lot of songs from his, pretty much all his career. The only thing I can complain about this is it doesn't have Junior's Farm on it, which I'm not sure if they played it or not. But you would think with a triple album they could have fitted it on here. And actually have two later Paul McCartney live albums, Tripping the Line Fantastic and Back in the USA, and those don't have Junior's Farm either. So what is up with that? Another thing that annoyed me, I couldn't believe, is that I saw Paul McCartney a few years ago in Citizens Bank Park, and I had seen the set list beforehand. So I forgot what songs he played in the encore, but my friends and I knew what they were, so we watched the first song and left. But it turns out he played Junior's Farm at that show. He added another song, so I missed it there too. Cannot believe it. But anyway, I didn't include this in my top 10 because I didn't grow up with it, just got it recently. It's a good live album, but it doesn't sound that great. I was familiar with all these live versions because they have a video of this out. I forgot what it's called. It's called Rock Show, I believe, and that was played on VH1 a lot throughout the 90s, so I had been familiar with most of these live versions, but finally I picked this. Actually, my friend gave me this. He had a better copy of it, so he gave me this one. Anyway, thanks a lot, and in your comments, put your favorite live albums and we can discuss. Thanks a lot.